Welcome back to Freeing the Founder. Today I'm joined by Bill Ryan, who is a highly accomplished business leader from the material handling industry. He oversaw a company grow from $20 million to $350 million in top line annual revenue. Tremendous wealth of insights on culture, leadership, and how to build trust, the type of trust that will help your company grow and scale. Full disclosure though, during my first question of Bill, we experienced a technical glitch, and so I lost the first 20 or 30 seconds of his response, but not to fret. We're going to be joining Bill mid-sentence, and I assure you this is a conversation that is absolutely worth watching and listening to. Here is Bill Ryan.
And traveled the country, built up stores, built up dealerships, sold some off. We had many factory stores back in those days, so like 16. So that's where I really got my MBA. It was on the road working with dealers and entrepreneurs. Then joined a company down here in North Carolina where I live currently, and it was $20 million when we got there. And when I left it was $350 million 10 years later. So learned a lot in that process in those years, making more mistakes than victories. But that's how we learn. And then I was able to join my partner and wife, who started a consulting company 10 years prior to that, called TDT1. And we joined our forces together. She was an IT specialist, working with all things analytical and accounting. And I lend my credence to the sales and marketing side, plus operations. And we had 16 clients for the better part of 10 years. And we just loved that part of the business, dealing with it. So, and now I'm kind of semi-retired. I do a little bit of work now and again. I have very fortunate to have a following of people and friends I've made over the years. And so on occasion, I'll get a phone call and say, "What do you think about this? What do you think about that?" So it's been a great life, and I really enjoy it.
That's amazing. And the reason I asked for that timeline is not to age you, Bill. It's actually to prove the point that you've seen it all. You've seen hypergrowth, you've seen generational shifts, you've seen societal, economic shifts. I think that's really important because in the work that you've done with Brenda in consulting, you've basically seen it all. You've seen the evolutions. And so now I'm curious, given that experience and all the perspective that you've collected over the years, what are some of the pivotal moments or realignments that you've seen? What was really behind the change in that company that would allow any company to grow and see that type of hypergrowth that you described earlier?
Great question, Reynold. And I have to say, there's no one size fits all that I can go to. But I will tell you, there were a number of things that occasioned the changes. Almost all of them had to do with change in ownership or perspective on the part of the owners. So it was either we're selling something because of the economic climate we were in or the condition of the company. In the case of the factory, certainly. We had, like I mentioned, we had 16 factory stores, and the company changed hands, and we had to dispose of those. We couldn't afford those. So that we had to sell those stores off. So that was the economic push, if you would. But the change behind that was to find entrepreneurs that were ready to embark on that portion of their life. So you had to help them with their funding and their leadership, their strategy among all things. Question them as to why are you doing this and are you capable, etc. And of the companies that we did approach, in almost all cases, there was some kind of crisis, sometimes financial, more often than not, market share wise, they just weren't performing, and their manufacturers, their OEMs, were putting a lot of pressure on them. And so they wanted to realign and get better. And in almost all these cases too, the solution to rectifying the problems almost always came down to people and leadership, or lack thereof. In one case, we had a gentleman who was in his late 60s, and he was just, he'd run out of gas, and he had two kids that were in the business. Neither one of them really were interested in being there. And his parent, the OEM that's supplying him at the time, recognized that and said, these kids just don't have. right? We're not going to point them to the dealership. So he was smart enough to call me and say, Bill, you got to come in and get me a leader. And so we did that. We put a profile together for a president for his company and went out to the interviews. And then I had to deal with his kids, and explain to them that they're going to be owners, but they weren't going to be running the company. So that's just one example of it. In another case, the reason we went to Charleston, South Carolina was the gentleman who owned that company down there. He had lost his two senior executives. He lost his sales manager and his operations manager within 60 days of each other. And so we had to go back down there and spend 4 years just realigning people, hiring people, putting processes in place. And sometimes it was a recessionary crisis, like 2001. We're working with a company that had never been through an economic downturn, so we had to help them resize and get things down. So as I said, it was always some kind of a crisis. But in the case of the company that I alluded to, that went from 20 million up to over 200 million, there was no crisis there per se. There was just a recognition and a willingness on the part of the owner to grow. He said, my company's stale. I really have been working at this thing for a long time. I really can't find the key. So our task was to sit down with him and say, well, what do you want to do? What are you capable of doing? Do you have the backing? Do you have the support? Do you have the people? And once we had the answers to at least most of those questions, we could start to put plans in place. That one was less of a crisis than a real honest desire on his part to get better.
I find this really interesting because certainly this is a story that many entrepreneurs and founders and business owners would want to tell about their career. Yet you've seen it and you've helped others do it. So could you dig in a little bit more into what that criteria looked like? If I was that owner right now, sitting in front of you, what exercise or exercises would you take me through to analyze and make sure that, yes, I am ready and that I have the right mindset to experience this hyper growth?
Great lead in. Love it. First thing we do is we sit down and have a conversation with you, Randall. Say, Randall, tell me about your life. Tell me about, where you're from. How many kids are in your family? What your parents do? How'd you grow up? All that, by way of me understanding what your character is, where you came from, how you're motivated, what your outlook on life is. And then I ask you about your values. What do you believe in? Are things like integrity and honesty and then, teamwork, all these things important to you or not? So I get a feel for, like I said, your character, but also now some of your vision and your capabilities. Then I go through the competence exercises. What's your background? What's your experience? Are you a left brain person, more engineer, or are you a right brain person, salesperson? So we can define, what it is you're going to be really good at doing. And then what are your ambitions? How big do you want to be or how profitable and why? And, then you've got a platform. You've done essentially a very short order SWOT analysis, where you explored some strengths, some weaknesses. Then out of that, you can start to identify the opportunities. And then later on, you talk about the threats, to the company. But it's really getting that fundamental or foundational understanding of who the person is. Because in my experience, everything hinges on leadership, everything. And so few owner operators or entrepreneurs, for that matter, that we've been exposed to, really have done that self-examination. Most of them have gotten to where they were in life out of sheer perseverance and diligence. They may have had a vision for how they do things for themselves, but to grow into a larger organization with a competent succession plan in place, those are different skills. Different skill set so you've got to help the owner operators recognize, yes, you've done a good job up until this point in time, but now you want to grow or you want to put together an exit strategy or plan. So there's some things we've got to do. We've got to assess your leadership group, your team. What the capabilities of that. Let's do a SWOT analysis for the whole dealership, for the whole team. And out of that, between the two of you come up with, okay, this is the vision, what it looks like. In the case of the gentleman I told you about in 2004, we got him. he was $20 million, but he only had, I think he had 3 facilities, and he had one product line. And in the material handling industry, that's just not the way to go about it. It's too limiting. And so we had to come to grips with that, hey, you're going to have to expand, you have to take on different products, different strategies. And we're going to have to get the people who have been so, used to doing it one way to start to realize that, hey, they're not as good as they think they are, right? Because in his case, that was an illusion they all had, that they had a brand name of a product that was, recognizable worldwide. But they were, woefully woefully underperforming, easy to say. And he didn't recognize it at first. So I had to show him some comparisons and say, look, here's what the real model looks like, or here's what the model of a successful, operation looks like with these characteristics and these people and all that. And it took about 30 days for him to finally say, you know what? Thank you. He said, you got me to look in the mirror and recognize that, no, we're not as good as we could be. He said, you got me to realize that it starts with me. I'm the one that's got to set the tone and the direction for where we're going to go from here. And I said, okay, great. Let's put a plan together. We put a strategy together over the course of the holidays that year, came back to each other, and it wasn't surprising. Our growth number in 10 years was exactly the same. I said, you can go from 20 million to 100 million in 10 years, and here's how. Anyway, that's my number 2, right? That's where I want. And so we had a strategy, and we added product, we added people, we changed the whole culture. I had to sit everybody down, and I said, look, you've gotten to this point in time this way, but if we're going to go to the future where the owner wants to go, it's not going to work this way. We've got to put these other things in place. So we concentrated on the culture. We certainly looked at the bank accounts and the finances and all that, but we really talked about the culture. And the culture, I can go on for hours about this, but it's an overused word that people say they think they understand. If the culture is actually the way things are, the way things are in the organization, are there hidden agendas? Are there secret things that are going on? Are there, does it live up to the motto that's on the wall, or is that just, talk or wall talk? But so the culture comes down to really 3 things. It comes down to the values, the values of the owner and the people in the organization. Are they have integrity? Are they customer focused? Are they honest? They want to work hard. All those values got to be in place, right? Then it comes down to the processes, the way we do things. Do we do things correctly? Do we do them consistently? Do we do them the right way, or what kind of haphazard catch can, right? And if you get those 2 things right, you're surrounded by people with similar values to you, and we all agree on the processes. This is the way we do it. This is the way we treat each other. This is the way we treat our customers and our people. And here's our priorities. Then we can start to formulate agreements, right? And the agreements, if you come to work every day with these values and you abide by these processes, here's what you get. Yes, you get paid, of course, and comparatively with good benefits, and all that we can afford. But you get to work with a company that really has, something to say for itself. We're really going someplace, and we want to do meaningful work. Because in my experience, Randall, I think everybody wants to work for a winner. Nobody wants to join the team that's in last place and not have an ambition to say, okay, we're going to raise the bar here. People will get discouraged and say, oh yeah, people just want to get paid. That's not been my experience. Now, people just want to get paid. We need the money, but we want to enjoy what we do, right? And as I shared with you earlier, that's part of why I feel so fortunate about being in this industry, because I learned to love it, and it's something that just gets me motivated every day. And you got to stop me. I could go on for hours about this.
And the impact you make.
Well, there you go. Yeah, and what is your legacy, right? That's another big important question that comes to mind when I think about approaching these entrepreneurs or these owners. What are you doing? What are the big questions in life for you? We're all going to leave this planet at some point in time. We all know that. We say we know it, but we don't really. But when you go, what's it going to look like? You don't want the company to dry up and blow away. do you have a succession plan? Do you have some ambitions for people? Because now you've got families. In the case of that small company, when we joined that company, there were 107 employees, and got to know every one of them and their families and their kids. And when I left, we were over 1,400 people, and I
Mm.
didn't know everybody, but I still knew the vast majority of people because that was the lesson I'd been taught, coming up through the initiatives. It's all about people. It's all about getting to know them, making yourself visible and providing them with some clear direction and good communications to say, you know, you guys can be great. You can be part of something wonderful here. And let me show you what that looks like. Um, and one of the early conversations we got into with the managers at all those companies was, they would say, as far as it was the forklift industry, I'd say, as far as I know, nobody's defined the Super Bowl for forklift dealerships. And they all laughed. I would say, yeah. I said, but if there was one, it would look like this. And I gave them seven criteria for these are the things, these are the goals, the measurables, the metrics that great companies, in our industry could aspire to. And if we just put those up there, we know what the best in the country is, and we work toward each one of these things every year, every month, every year. I will tell you that if we get to within, 10% of being number one in those seven categories, I'm going to lay claim to that Super Bowl trophy, you know, and that was inspirational for people. They'd go, wow, well, we're headed for big things around here, right? And a guy said to me one day, he said, geez, Bill, he said, look what you've done. He said, you've turned the forklift industry into a religion. And I said, no, but yeah, I said, but I appreciate that you see that the people believe they can be the best, all the while knowing that they're not there yet. They still need to be humble and you come to work every day trying to get better, but also taking care of each other too. They're really caring about people. That's key to the whole thing.
There's so much to unpack here, Bill. This is a gold mine of an experience. So thank you for putting this on the table. I want to get one small fact clarified for this company that achieved this 200 million plus. Were you
Mhm.
hired on as the number two, or were you consulting from the outside looking in?
I was actually hired on as what was to be number one for this. So actually, I could drop back and tell you this division that we went to was part of another larger company. There was the material handling division of a large equipment company. And initially, when I met him, we went in as a consultant and to talk about the course of events and what we need to do. And within 2 days, he said, I need you. I said, okay, let's talk about that. What would that look like? And then where you want to go with it? And it almost didn't happen because uh, he was he was successful. He had a lot of money. He was third generation. Um, and I had to come to the decision, okay, can I really help this guy? Is he, he, he thought he was the smartest guy in the room, most all the time. Usually he was, but he wasn't careful about protecting that either. And that was part of the reason he had not grown, or the company had not grown, because the people weren't inspired. Um, so it was some decision making, and Brenda and I both consulted on it, for better part of 30 days. And finally said, okay, let's commit to this, because he has agreed that he'll look in the mirror and recognize that it's not as good as it could be, and so we went from there. Incidentally, too, I said over 200 million. They're $385 million now.
Wow.
Um, so it's proof in the pudding, and they're continuing to grow. They're doing really well.
Bill, that is such a pivotal moment that you described, when that owner operator looks in the mirror and realizes, oh crap, I got to look at myself now and address some things. What was key to guiding that individual to get to that point?
Wow. Um, I'd say as much as anything, it was and I'll just call it what it is, pat myself on the back here, my courage and willingness to confront him and say, hey, we'll agree to do this. We'll agree to help you with this, but you got to earn our trust, right? And I've got to earn yours, right? Yeah, because without that, we're not going to go anyplace, right? And he told me he admired that, that we'd approach it that way, but then we sat down and had a long conversation about what trust is, and I said, well, according to my reading, I said, but my practical experience too, it's really four things. Trust is integrity. If a person doesn't have integrity, they don't do what they say they're going to do, we won't trust them, or can't be trusted. Second party is confidence. They can say they're going to do anything, but can they really do it? Because we don't believe they can, we're probably not going to trust that either. Third part is experience. Have you done this before? Oh, yeah, you're telling me you can do it, but can you show me? In my case, I showed him 3 examples of how we turn companies around. So there's no question in his mind about that. But the last piece of trust that's more important than those other 3 is intent. Why? Why are we doing this? Are we doing this just to make a lot of money? Because that's never a solid motivation for growth. Well, certainly it's a measure of growth, but it's not a reason. It's not a reason. You just don't grow for the sake of growing. You grow for the sake of providing tools and mechanisms and opportunities to families to be able to take care of their families, and do things and grow and provide, a higher level of service for all the customers that are out there. One of the highest compliments I ever got was I visited one of our branches down in southern Georgia one time, and one of the technicians down there, who become pretty good friend of mine in a very short time, he just had a baby boy, and he named the boy Gunner, which I thought was a really cool name for a little kid, right? Gunner. I said, so what's the future going to be like for Gunner? And he said, he's going to be a technician right here at this company. I thought, oh my goodness, really? He said, yeah, absolutely. And that was 20 years ago, and the kid's working there. He's a technician, working beside his dad, which I think is just really fantastic.
That's
So,
amazing.
mhm.
How important is establishing that fit? Because I sense that that's what was remunerating in your mind when you were considering, is this something we want to move forward? Because as you said, you were a consultant, and this offer was put on the table for you. Could you talk about that criteria that you personally had to decide, yes, this is something that is worth pursuing?
Mhm. Yes, my criteria at the time, and Brenda and I sat and talked about it for a while and said, okay, this is going to be a long-term commitment, at least 10 years. At the time, this was 2004. So we'll commit to 10 years. Can we, can we see ourselves in this role? Can we see ourselves with this owner, with this company, and are we prepared to withstand, whatever comes our way? But back to having integrity, you say you're going to do something, you've got to be prepared to do it. So it wasn't until over dinner, or, good sushi dinner, a place right down the street from us, we could went to for years, that I looked in her eyes and said, Brenda, what do you think? She said, maybe you tell me, what do you think? And I said, I think this is the right one. She goes, yep, I do too. So we had that agreement and she was my partner. I mean, I trusted her with everything and anything. Her insight to people was extremely valuable to me over the course of my career, especially with other men. Um, and this is probably just me, and I don't mean this to be generic specific or whatever. But women, they look at life and people differently than most men do. Men, we're simpler. We can be fooled. Where somebody can give us a good spiel or make us laugh about something, and we sold to me. Women are more discerning. They've been lied to their whole lives, so they can figure out what's the truth and what's not. And so I was always tried to include her in any conversation we had with prospective employees, especially men, and receptionists as well too. Right, bring a guy in for an interview with a sales interview, and everybody in the building goes, "Wow, this guy's really good." And on the way out, I'd say to the receptionist, "What do you think?" And she go, "Nope." I go, "Really?" She go, "Yeah, you don't want that guy." So the criteria was can we trust this guy? And the answer was yes. And we also shared that with him too. I was back to courage and having the wherewithal to be able to be openly honest and say, there were some days that he just was, it was a butthead, and it was up to me to be able to say, hey, you're being a butthead today. You need to get out of the way, which is not something that most people are comfortable in doing. But at that point in my life, in my career, I was in my 50s, had done okay for myself. And I was confident, maybe a little cocky. But the fact that I was willing to confront him was refreshing to him, because, like I said, he'd come from a wealthy family, third generation, and nobody had ever really done it with him. They were all willing to kowtow and then bow down to him and then acquiesce. And I just said, I'm not that. I'm not that guy. I'm not your yes man, and it's not going to work if the best way it's going to be. Did I respect him? Oh, absolutely. Um, like I said, smartest guy in the room. Harvard MBA. Yeah, he was really, really smart. Um, Empathetic, not so much, right? And it was part of my job to point that out to him and just say, you do great on the podium. You do great in the boardroom. Um, you know, well, I'm taking you out of this interview. You'll just come across as somebody that people go, oh my God, I can't work for that guy. He's scary, right?
Right.
So and you deal with personalities and you work through them, not around them. Um, and sometimes they're uncomfortable, but if you're afraid to have those open conversations, you're not going to be happy. You're going to go home and, things are going to be miserable and you're going to start winding yourself down. I just tell people, you don't know, you owe that to yourself not to be unhappy at your work. You can be challenged, but you can have bad days. We're all going to have ups and downs. But at the end of the day, you want to be able to say, yeah, I did good work today. I really enjoyed it. And looking forward to tomorrow. Um,
I would dare say too, just listening to you tell this story, that your personalities were a yin and a yang. You used the word empathy, right? And so if this individual was perhaps not the most
mhm,
uh, uh, empathetic or registering as the highest EQ, I can tell you, Bill, you did. And so that's that yin and yang that I can
mhm.
appreciate. Take us to a moment where you would say was probably the most challenging time that you've had with this individual. And without sharing the sensitivities, could you give some color as to what the issue was, why it was contentious, and you how you broached the situation to solve?
A great question. The one that comes to mind is that we had, as I told you, we had come into a smaller organization with one product line, and they had a sales manager there, had been there for been a part of 18 years, I think, or close to 2 decades. And he had firmly entrenched himself. He was the quote unquote leader, thought he was anyway. And but he had a personality that was less than authentic. Let's say it that way. He good in front of customers. He could sell snow cones to Eskimos if you asked him to. But behind the scenes, there was always questions about what's his real motivation. And back to relying on your colleagues to assess it. Brenda met him and she said right away, no, there's something wrong with this guy. He's not true. He's not telling you the truth. He's licking your boots, but he's not really believing it. And it became pretty obvious to me right away. And so I looked at the rest of the people in the organization that were reporting to him, and half of the organization was, and they were all following suit. There was a lot of insincere people that were out for the money. They really didn't care. They pretended to care about customers of the company, but they really weren't invested. And so I recognized that in order for this organization to change, either this individual is going to have to change or I'm going to have to change him. And by that, I mean, have him move on. And so confronting the owner with that, he was like, you kidding? This guy's been here 18 years. I said, yeah. I said, and this is part of why you are where you are, and you're going to have to come to grips with that because if you're charging me to run the company, and first thing is this guy was offended that I came in, over him. Because like I said, thought he had tenure, thought he was entitled. Um, but I got the owner on the same wavelength with myself. I said, I'm just going to confront him and tell him what's going on. And I said, I expect that he's going to turn to you. And so we had the conversations, and they were hard conversations with this individual. He was a good person. Don't get me wrong. He just grown up the wrong way, I think, in the visit. If there was a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it, he could figure out a way to do the wrong way the first time around. And which was extra work and just a mess. And so when I confronted him and said, we're going to change, he went away angry. And then I got a call from the owner that night. He said, well, so-and-so just called me. He wants to have breakfast tomorrow. I said, I'm not surprised. He said, so what do I expect? And I said, he's going to tell you how bad I am. I'll tell you what a bad boss I am and how I'm missing the boat and all that. And so the owner was ready. And so they had their 7:30 breakfast, and 9 o'clock phone rings. It's the owner. And he said, good job. I said, what do you mean? He said, he just quit. I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, because I backed you up. I reinforced everything that you had told him. And he was shocked, and then, but we said, okay, but we wish him well. He's going to, have to take care of his family. So we helped to usher him off into another company. So there were no hard feelings other than, he was felt like, he'd been run over, I guess. But the reality was, he went on to another company and he changed his ways, or at least so I was told. And I think he had a better future after that. But the day that happened, the other people in the organization were at my door in my office thanking me. Saying, thank you for having the courage to make that move. Because, we all knew that this wasn't right. This wasn't working for all of us. And there was a breath of fresh air. And many times I went back to them in months and years later and said, tell me why you were afraid to come to me and talk about, what this individual was asking you to do or the way things are going on. They said, well, he was the boss, and I needed my job. I didn't want to, get on the bad side. So, pivotal moment in the growth of the company, but more importantly, pivotal in the growth of the culture, to have everybody recognize that, oh my God, he said things are going to change, and yeah, they're changing, right? And we can move in the right direction. And it was pretty much, don't get me wrong, there was a ton of work after that. But we set our plan out from there, and we had, I guess we had 99% of the people on board, but we had 80% of the people on board. And we know that's factual because we measure it every year. We send out employee surveys and they come back, and, we do the best dealer in the country had an employee engagement score of 88, and we were like 50. And we told everybody, we're going to get to be 88. We're going to get up there, back to the Super Bowl. And it took us 3, 4, 5 years, with changes in HR and communications and reviews and all that. But we got up to, 84%, which is high water country for pretty much any industry I've ever been exposed to. And that was one of those 7 measures that I talked about earlier.
What a brilliant story and an awesome payoff. I'm curious. Well, as you had mentioned, you were the change agent. And to some people, that's both liberating and at times, probably in the early days, a little scary because the people you were leading didn't know you were still getting to know them. But how did you, over the course of 3, 4 years, keep that alignment so strong? Because that's what it takes. It takes strong alignment to the North Star. What did you have to do day in, day out in order to achieve that?
A great question, don't know where I learned it. Somewhere along, I actually think I learned it from my parents, about being, about connecting with people. My mother as a kid, she was always so kind to everybody, but especially, waiters and waitresses and, the mailman and, the kid, out the street, that didn't have any shoes on. My mother was always so empathetic and kind with people. I learned that from her and from them, and to always, always recognize how important people are. That none of us are better than any of the rest of us. That we've all got jobs to do. We've all got to be, in place to get it done. And so they bequeathed to me that ability to talk to people, to connect with them. And I got to say, it's got to be sincere, because my experience, I don't think I ever knew of a different way to go about it, but I've been around people who pretended to be sincere, pretended to be, really care about people, say they did. But you can tell it in their actions. You can tell it in their commentary or the lack of interaction sometimes. No, they really weren't. They weren't that interested in other people. And part of my job, like I could tell from day one, especially in this last venture where I described, was to connect with people and just say, hey, tell me about how's your day? What's going on here? And not being afraid to, walk out in the shop and not be afraid. I love to walk out in the shop and sit down at the picnic table with the technicians and cut up with them and talk about what's going on, what's going on with their families, and caring enough to know a little bit about their kids, and I say, hey, did your kid make the ball team? I know he was trying out. Did he make it? Those connections are just, they're worth the weight in gold. Because people go, oh my God, the president asked me about my kid. I haven't seen him in 3 months, and they come back and right away he remembers that, yeah, my kid was trying out for baseball. Small things, seemingly, but important to people, because, like I said earlier, in my experience, in my education, everything hinges on leadership. As goes the leader, goes the organization, and so that leader's got to have, it's incumbent upon him or her to convey gravitas, which is that comfort, that wisdom, that confidence that, hey, we're all in this together, and we're going to be okay. There's going to be ups and downs, or challenges. We have to be honest with each other. But this is my job, is not to do your job, but to help you do it safely, correctly, with the right processes. So that you go home, like I said earlier, every night you go, hey, that was a good day. I really enjoyed working with this company. And one of the things I discovered early on, but was able to, I won't say perfect, because I don't think I ever got there, but to improve on, was communications. And, there's nothing that replaces a one-to-one conversation with somebody. That there's just nothing beyond that. I mean, the more you can do it, the better you're going to be at it. And I had 1,400 people that were ready, willing, and able audiences wherever I went. We had 18 branches by the time I left there. So to know them, to know their names, and I've been lucky to have a decent memory. So I might not get the whole family name right, but at least got their first name. So it was a connection that way. But to be able to sit down and talk a little bit about the business and what's going on, and listen to them and say, okay, tell me really, what do you think about this company? And we'd have meetings with technicians, and I'd say, okay, guys, we'll have a little meeting here. I said, and we're going to employ Las Vegas rules. And they don't go, what's that? I say, anything that goes on in this room stays in this room, right? Unless it's a safety issue or an ethics issue, I got to do something about that. But everything else, you tell me, how do things work around here? How they don't work? And in a room full of 8 guys, they're not going to tell you right away. But you keep doing it, quarter after quarter, year after year. Pretty soon they call for the meeting, and they say, hey, why are we doing this? And I say, wow, I don't know. Did you ask your manager? And he said he didn't know either. Well, let's talk about a different way to do it. Maybe there's a better way to do it. Something less wasteful or less, cumbersome. And some of the best ideas that we came up with to grow that company came from the ranks, came from the technicians, came from the parts people. Sometimes the people in the accounting department would say, this customer called up and complained about this billing, right? Why do we do it this way? Well, good. Let's change it. And so that became my job. And toward the end of my career, when I knew I was getting out of there, I told everybody 2 years before I was ready to leave that we're going to make a succession plan, and here's what's going to happen. And so no surprises. And I said, we're going to have a smooth transition, and which I'm pretty proud to say that, yes, we had a smooth transition. When I left, we were at 285 million. Now they're 370 million, I think. So and the same leaders, they've grown, they've added people. It's good. But at the end, it was like, okay, well, I know my job is not to do people's jobs. But then somewhere along the line, I realized that, to grow managers and to grow the leaders, my job is not to give them the answers all the time. And so again, don't know where I got it. I'm sure I borrowed it from somebody. But I found a phrase where I employed it, where a manager would come in and say, can we get 5 minutes? I said, sure, what's going on? Well, I ran into this situation and, I don't know what to do. What do you think? And I'd say, well, what do you think about it? And sometimes they dance around it. But 9 times out of 10, they come up with, well, I think maybe we could do this. Yeah, it sounds right. Let's go ahead and give that a shot, right? So it didn't come from me, it came from them. But then on occasion, there was some situations came up. And I remember this one manager in particular, where they'd come in and say, well, I don't know what to do about this. I said, well, what have you done? What have you thought about? And they say, I'm blank. I can't come up with anything. And I looked at him and I said, Emmett, I said, if you did know, right? I said, I know you don't know. That's okay. I said, but if you did know, what would you do? And he answered me right away. Right? I thought, okay, I gave you permission not to know, and you really did know in the back of your mind. Then a couple months later, he comes to me. He said, "I got another problem." He said, "I don't know what to do, and don't ask me if I did. If I don't tell me that it's okay not to know, but if I did know." He said, "Because I just don't know." I thought there's another lesson, right? You take it so far. But that became my job toward the end. The last year was not to answer people's questions, not to provide them with direction. It was just to support them, and thank them. I spent all my time traveling the branches and just thanking everybody every day for everything they did. And somewhere along the line too, I also discovered that finding good things to talk about with people is not that difficult. People tend to think managers come to my location and they're going to find all these things wrong. They're going to be critical of this, critical of that. How come this isn't bad? How come this isn't this way? Looking at the financials, etc. And yeah, they expect that. But if you show up and you are applauding them for the good things that happen, the improvement in the safety record, or the cleanliness of the shop, or the productivity, or the accounts receivable coming down, and people will have to sit back and go, "Oh wow, he came to town and he told us what a great job we're doing." So, and then one of the other things in communication that I discovered was an effective use of email. Because I always thought email was impersonal. Didn't really like it as a tool. But back to this concept of the Super Bowl for forklift dealerships, we came up with that scheme and all the criteria for it. And every month we'd sit down and review it, and everybody would publish it. Say, well, we fell short in this mark, this month, whatever. And if we hit our quarterly numbers, we had a profit sharing program. And it was for everybody that was not on a bonus or a commission, right? But all the people on rank and file. And every quarter we measure it, we set a target. If we hit those targets, everybody got some money. Everybody got a payout, right? And when I first introduced this concept, my managers said, "This is not a good idea." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Well, people get paid to do their job. I bet that should be enough." And I said, "Really?" I said, "Then why are you guys on bonus points, right? You do your work, you get paid, right? But you expect at the end of the year to get a bonus because you hit certain goals or objectives, right? Why is that any different for anybody else in the organization, right?" So they said, "Well, this is going to be a lot of work." Because I know, but let's try it. Then they came back and said, "Yeah, but it's okay as long as it works. If we have a good quarter and everybody gets a check, right? A couple $100 doesn't really matter how big it is." I said, "But then it's going to come a time when we don't make it, and we're going to have to tell them that we didn't make it." I said, "Okay." I said, "Yeah, that's a reality." I said, "But let's look at our values again. What's number one? Integrity. What does integrity stand for? It's doing what you said you're going to do, but it's doing the right thing, right? So we tell everybody, hey, we're going to be open and honest with you, and when we make it, great. We're all going to celebrate. We're all going to be happy and share the wealth. But if we don't, we need to tell them that as well, and why we fell short." Well, we went along for a year and a half, almost, maybe, probably into the third quarter of the second year. And every quarter we hit our targets, and every quarter we grew, and everybody was making good money. And it was actually the end of the second quarter, now that I think about it. And we fell short, not by a lot, but by enough so we didn't make it. So my email that went out the fifth day of every month that talked about all the great strides we had and the great orders we got and all the wonderful things we did, and ended with a, "By the way, we made our quarterly target and everybody's entitled to some profit sharing." That month it came out and I said, "Thank you for this. Thank you for that. We did all the good things in the month." I said, "However, I told you that we would tell you, we're going to be honest, that when we didn't make it, we didn't make it." I said, "We didn't make it in the second quarter, and here's why." And actually, I take it back. It was the third quarter. And I would get emails back. I sent it out to everybody in the company, and I would get maybe, I don't know, 150 emails back. And my admin, my executive assistant, would say, "Do you want me to answer all these emails?" I said, "No, I really don't want you to do that. I'll be here till 9:00 tonight, but I'm going to answer each one of these emails." And so I'd get 100 plus every month thanking me. What a great company, blah, blah, blah. When I sent that message out about we didn't make it, sorry, but we didn't make it, I got probably 300 emails saying, "Thank you for telling us the truth. What do we need to do?" Right?
Wow.
So we doubled down and we blew the numbers out of the water in the fourth quarter. So much so that I went back to the owner and I said, "Look, we didn't make it in the third quarter, but we doubled in the fourth quarter. I think we owe everybody profit share, not only from the fourth quarter, but also from the third quarter. And he agreed. So everybody got big checks, that January. And I tell you that by all way of saying that became my job. My job became to be the cheerleader, um, the cultural coordinator, and also the role model too. I was very conscious of the fact that, I was very visible, open door policy. Anybody could stop by. I encouraged people to, stop by headquarters when I was there. It was great to see them. And then, of course, there were time constraints too, where I couldn't do everything I wanted to do, but not to get in the way, not to micromanage people, not to be making decisions for them, but encouraging them to make their own decisions and in essence, mimic my behavior. Mhm. That sounds egotistical, but to a degree, there were certain criteria that I expected each one of them to maintain. That rapport, that gravitas, that honesty and integrity. If you don't do those things, you can't be on this team. Um, I had to reprimand a couple of people a couple of times. Um, and that was obvious to everybody in the rank and file too. They all saw that. They said, yep, that's the way you do it. Mhm.
Bill, I'm not just saying this. This is hands down one of the best conversations, if not the best conversation I've had. As I told you earlier, I've got a tremendous amount of respect and admiration for you. And I told you initially I was going to keep this to 30 minutes, but I says, no, Bill has so much wisdom that please don't be surprised if I ask you for a second recording, if I may.